Hello everyone, this is Jen and I make useful English Lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary devices and more to help you get top grades in the subject. So in this video today we are going to be doing an essay walkthrough, and specifically I'm going to be showing you guys a sample essay on a GCSE English Lit 19th century novel paper question. And it's actually from the 2021 paper. And we are going to be looking at the one on A Christmas Carol today, just because lots of you are obviously studying this text. I will be making other sample essay walkthrough videos on the other 19th century novel texts, specifically Jekyll and Hyde, and perhaps also Frankenstein, which I know are the other relatively more popular texts covered by schools. So regardless, today we are going to be focusing on A Christmas Carol. And we're going to be looking at this specific extract on the left, as you can see, which is taken from chapter 2 of the novella. And in this extract, we're told that the ghost of Christmas past shows Scrooge the Christmas party he attended at Mr. Fezziwig's warehouse when he was a young man. And so the question for this is, you can tell from the right, which I've copied on the Google Doc. Starting with this extract, explore how Dickens presents ideas about joy and happiness in A Christmas Carol. So immediately we know that the key terms here are joy and happiness. So this is the topic that we have to focus on when we answer this question. We're asked to write about how Dickens presents joy and happiness in this extract on the left that's given to us, and how Dickens presents ideas about joy and happiness in the novel as a whole. So this is probably familiar to everyone, this format. We're supposed to engage with the extract that's given to us and also zoom out and engage with the novel as a whole. And I'm sure that you guys watching this video are aware that you have to be hitting all of the assessment objectives, 1, 2, 3, and 4, which I'm not going to go through necessarily in detail. But as I go through this sample essay, you will be able to see which are the points that hit those AOs, so that you can understand how you can write an essay in a similar manner where you'll be able to hit all of the key assessment objectives and get top grades. And with that, let's begin. So first of all, we have the intro, and immediately we start by acknowledging that we are engaging with the extract that's given. So the student says, in the extract, Dickens presents joy and happiness through the generosity of spirit embodied by Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig, who are Scrooge's ex-employers. So in this sentence, we know the student has very clearly summarized what the extract is about. By deploying a moment of flashback, the author transports the now miserly Scrooge to his youth, and by virtue of the distance in time, produces a clarity of perspective on Scrooge's part about the role that money plays in happiness. So a couple of observations here. The student brings in a pertinent technical term, flashback, right? So this is a narrative technique whereby the author gets the character to recall or experience a moment in the past. So the flashback helps to show Scrooge what he used to think when he was a young man, obviously when he was much less miserly than he is now. This student also very quickly tells us what the effect of this narrative technique is, right? Which is to produce a clarity of perspective on Scrooge's part, which is important to recognize because we see that the transformation that's going to take place throughout this novel is all based on the increasing clarity about what really matters in life that Scrooge kind of gains over the course of his journey with those ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future. So very clearly the student is showing both a thematic and also a technical awareness. The student goes into telling us pretty much what she thinks is the main argument of her essay, which is the overarching idea embodied both in this extract and the novella at large. Giving, not taking, is the ultimate source of joy and happiness, which is a message aligned with the dominant Christian teachings and mores in Victorian England. So again, very clearly we see a couple of things happening here. Giving, not taking is the ultimate source of joy and happiness is the main message about joy and happiness that Dickens wants to convey in this extract. According to the student, it's a student's interpretation, but what's important is that the student spells this out very clearly for the examiner to know, okay, this is going to be the main line of argument that she's going to be explaining and analysing and unpacking in the rest of this essay. Great signposting. And then also the student very nicely couches it with a contextual observation, which is that back in Victorian England, it was predominantly a Christian society with people very much following Christian teachings and mores. And of course, one of the key tenets of Christian morality is this importance of generosity and charity to fellow men. So very nicely, we see hitting all of the big assessment objectives here, really promising. You have showing the awareness of the author's methods. You have a clear thesis statement, which is the line of argument. And then you also show this awareness of the contextual background, hitting all of the big assessment objectives. And then the student nicely rounds up this intro by saying, in the rest of this essay, I will discuss how Dickens presents this idea through various methods in the extract and beyond. And so a very clear segue into our first main body paragraph. A central idea in this extract is that magnanimity is a key source of happiness, which is borne out by Dickens' association of the fezziwigs with the motif of light. So we see the student spells out for us the first key idea, Key idea 1 we see here that is related to the main argument, right? That you see in green, that I've highlighted in green in the intro, right? So it's a sub-idea, right, from this argument in the intro. Also, the student tells us she's going to be engaging with this author's method, specifically the use of motif, the use of a light motif, right? And so she's going to go on to explain how this use of motif of light illustrates her key idea number 1. So she goes on to say, on the one hand, old Fezziwig is almost haloized as a saintly figure, as a positive light appeared to issue from his calves. First quotation here that the student brings in, reminding one of the illuminating aura that often encircles angels and saints in Christian iconography. So this is fantastic because it shows contextual awareness back to the Christianity point, but also reminds us of this association with the saintly figures and naturally with holiness and moral righteousness, which is very much kind of central to the characterization of Fezziwig at this point. And then she goes on to bring in another technique, which is simile. And she says, the simile of them having shone in every part of the dance like moons, another quotation from the extract, suggests their generous giving nature. Why does the simile comparing the Fezziwig to moons suggest generosity? She goes on to explain for us. Because just as the moon shines its rays indiscriminately onto everyone on earth, so the Fezziwigs shake hands with every person individually and wished everybody a Merry Christmas. So this is fantastic because she's drawing a close parallel between the way the moon is liberal and generous, so to speak, with its rays, because when we think about it, the moon doesn't at all discriminate who it decides to shine on. Everyone on Earth gets to see and enjoy the moonlight. And so in the same way, Fezziwig doesn't discriminate between who they greet or shake hands with or wish Merry Christmas, right? So everyone at the party is treated in an equally generous way. And so she draws this lovely, lovely parallel between the moon simile and also the Fezziwig's characterization. Here showing a really kind of conceptualized engagement with the text. And she goes on to say, further, the couple's joy is reflected in their lightness of step and their briskness of movement during the dance, as suggested by the kinesthetic diction, clipped clauses, and playful staccato rhythms of advance and retire, both hands to your partner, bow and curtsy, corkscrew, thread the needle, and back again to your place, Fezziwig cut so deftly. She's engaging with this rather intricate description of the way the Fezziwigs are dancing with each other at the party. And so she says, well, through the kinesthetic diction, which basically means the words related to movement, right? We see advance, retire, bow and curtsy, corkscrew, thread the needle, cutting deftly, etc. The clipped clauses, the very short phrases, playful staccato rhythm, as we can see, the kind of choppiness in the syntax here in this section. All of these methods combined convey a sort of lightness of step and briskness of movement. So this tells us that the Fezziwigs are also light because they are happy. They experience this sort of emotional lightness because, as opposed to Scrooge's sort of emotional heaviness, because they are so generous, because they have given so much, right? And that's why they're actually so light. And by hosting a Christmas party to give back to their employees, the Fezziwigs attain a level of spiritual contentment that is far more valuable than the few pounds of mortal money they had spent on the event, as they live out a charitable state of mind which makes them feel good about themselves and contrasts sharply with Scrooge's calculating personality and its resulting misery. So this is fantastic as well, because the student here is engaging already with the novel beyond the extract, right? As she brings in Scrooge, she brings in the older Scrooge as a foil, as a contrast to the Fezziwigs. Very clearly we see in this main body paragraph, again, the student has astutely identified some of the key author's methods with motif, simile, diction, syntax and rhythm, etc., but also, most importantly, explained their effects and how they individually illustrate this key idea, which is that magnanimity results in happiness. So as we move on to the second main body paragraph, the student brings in another key idea, which is related to the main line of argument, as she says, another perhaps more nuanced idea about joy that Dickens conveys in this moment is that happiness also comes from exercising power in moral, judicious ways. And so this is indeed slightly more nuanced, but a good observation here. From knowing that one has the wherewithal of determining the happiness or lack thereof of others, but choosing consciously to make others happy with the resources one has. The fact that Fezziwig could have easily opted to be a tyrannical rather than a benign employer is hinted at by the triple juxtaposition in Scrooge's riposte to the spirit's teasing remarks, when he points out that Fezziwig has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. So those of you who know what juxtaposition is, you'll know that happy or unhappy, light or burdensome, and pleasure or toil are the three examples of juxtaposition here, placing these opposite ideas adjacent to each other. And so the line between deciding to be generous versus cruel is thin. As someone in a position of power, Fezziwig could have inclined towards either orientation and not suffer any consequences. And yet he earns respect from all because he chooses to be generous and kind towards his workers. So this is really subtle reading here, because essentially what the student is saying is that Dickens, by placing these opposite contrasting ideas next to each other in such close proximity, he's subliminally communicating this idea that it's actually very easy for someone in power like Fezziwig to choose to go one or the other way. So the line between choosing to make your employees happy, to make their lives easier, is just as easy as choosing to make them unhappy and to work them to the bone. But the fact that he chooses to not do the wrong thing, but instead to do the right thing, shows that he is able to exercise power in moral and judicious and disciplined ways, in a magnanimous way. And so she goes on to say, given the widespread exploitation of labourers and children at the height of the Industrial Revolution when the novella was published, this flattering portrayal of a capitalist master shows Dickens' sensitivity to human nuance. This is fantastic again because the student is weaving in contextual understanding into her interpretation. And this interpretation is also a nuanced and sophisticated one because it doesn't resort to this sort of simplistic black and white evil versus good kind of dichotomy that one would normally sort of associate with, the capitalist factory owners versus the workers and laborers. And then she goes on to level up this even more by bringing in a critical interpretative lens. Viewed from a Marxist interpretative lens, Scrooge would seem to fit the heartless capitalist archetype. But Dickens resists framing the social relationship between employers and employees in a simplistic exploiter versus exploited dichotomy and acknowledges the more sympathetic characterization of Fezziwig that there were also humane employers who cared about their workers' well-being. Now, this is great because the student is, on the one hand, bringing in her understanding of what a Marxist critical approach would assume, but she is choosing to acknowledge that Dickens writes in a more humanistic way, and that perhaps, as I mentioned, this sort of binary dichotomous interpretative framework doesn't quite do justice to Dickens' more humanistic portrayal and style of writing. So having engaged with the extract and analysed two key ideas, the student then zooms out to engage with the rest of the novel as a whole, which is, of course, the other part of the question that we must not forget. So she goes on to say, the idea that generosity, not wealth, creates joy and happiness is likewise reflected in the warm, merry atmosphere of Bob Cratchit's family, and conversely, in the absolute lack of joy from Scrooge's life prior to his transformation at the end of the story. Fantastic. So the student is telling us, signposting again very clearly, she's going to be looking at Bob Cratchit and family's characterization, as well as Scrooge's life and his sort of lack of joy in a kind of negative reflection. This student is clearly engaging with the main line of argument and reminding the examiner in a really smart way at every step of the essay that she is engaging with the question, she is illustrating her main line of argument and using the pertinent examples, methods, and evidence from the text to do this. So she says, the Cratchits are materially and financially poor, with Bob wearing shabby cuffs and threadbare clothes on Christmas Day, right? So here, very clearly illustrating for us the characterization of Bob as a poor man and Mrs. Cratchit having to make do with meager amounts of ingredients for the festive meal. And yet, the family are spiritually rich and emotionally content for the love and gratitude they feel towards each other. Then she goes on to illustrate this specifically with the scene about their Christmas meal. The Cratchits show that happiness has little to do with acquiring an abundance of wealth or resources, and this is most vividly captured in the Christmas Eve meal scene in Starve 3, or Chapter 3. When, as supposedly pedestrian an action as Mrs. Cratchit carving up the turkey elicited one murmur of delight all around the board. So bringing in a quotation here to tell us how joy and happiness manifests in the family. The hyperbolic, giddy and exclamatory tone, another method here addressing tone and hyperbole, in the descriptions of the family's responses to the meal reinforces the sense of authentic joy felt by the whole family. So here telling us how the use of methods create this effect that is related to the idea that we are arguing for. From Bob's gushing remarks of, there never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked, the youngest Cratchits steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows, which is, of course, a hyperbolic description of just how much they ate to their hearts and tummy's delight for finishing all the food, to the excited cries of hurrah, hallo throughout the scene. So bringing in all of the quotations here to illustrate this point about how the Cratchits are happy in just the company of each other despite the meagre and impoverished conditions that they live in. On the other hand, and she moves on to the other example from the text, prior to Scrooge's moral epiphany at the end, he is never once presented in a joyous demeanour. But upon realising that charity and generosity are the key to fulfilment, as he raises Bob's salary and commits to helping the struggling Cratchits, Scrooge's own heart laughed, which is a quotation from the very end of the novel, with a personification, of course, is of the heart, right? The heart laughing, with the personification suggesting that true contentment has finally been achieved within, as he is motivated by his trip down memory lane to embrace a charitable mindset once and for all. This is great because the student ultimately zooms out of the extract and looks at the entire characterization and the entire trajectory of characterization of the protagonist Scrooge to say, well, throughout the novel, we've not seen Scrooge joyous and happy at all, and it really isn't until he becomes generous and giving that he reaches the state of joy and happiness. And so finally, we reach the conclusion. By drawing an inverse relation between joy and wealth, spiritual fulfillment and financial success, Dickens conveys through Fezziwig, Scrooge and the Cratchit family's characterization the clear idea that happiness stems from a generosity of spirit and a willingness to give. Fantastic summary here, and using quite sophisticated language, keeping it conceptualized by drawing an inverse relation, right? So this idea that joy does not have to relate to wealth and vice versa, and that spiritual fulfillment has pretty much nothing to do with financial success most of the time. And then she also wraps up by saying that she's looked at Fezziwig from the extract, Scrooge and the Cratchit family from the novel as a whole to illustrate this idea. While both old Fezziwig and Scrooge are wealthy, their wealth does not determine the level of their happiness. The former is joyful because he cares about his employees, while the latter, until his moral conversion, is miserable because he only cares about his self-interest. Again, really nicely engaging with the character in the extract and also the protagonist in the novel as a whole as these foils, these contrasting characters, right, to illustrate the main idea. With such a strong Good Samaritan message, it is perhaps little wonder that A Christmas Carol proved so popular with the Victorian middle-class readership, whose predominantly Christian morals would likely have aligned with those championed in Dickens' book. This is a nice ending because it recontextualizes the novel and shows us the sort of social and cultural significance of the work. And it shows a kind of more sophisticated, higher level, and definitely top grade engagement with the text. And so you can tell from my walkthrough just now that the student pretty much hit all of the assessment objectives. And so you have assessment objective 1, which is to show kind of conceptualized awareness and sustained engagement with the extract and the text, which we see throughout this essay very clearly, no doubts about that. And then also the other AOs, where you've got AO2 demonstrating and coming through in the many observations about the author's methods, and we see all of that actually in the yellow highlights throughout the essay. So no doubts about that as well, that the student has engaged with AO2, and more specifically, it isn't just that the student has identified these author's methods, but that the student is able to glean the effect of the use of these methods and link it to how these methods help the author illustrate his main ideas and themes. And then also you have AO3, which is the contextual point, and we see that again in the way the student very nicely overarches and threads throughout the essay, subtly at the appropriate points, these ideas about how generosity and charity were key ideas in Victorian Christian teaching, and also this social contextual point in the middle of the essay about how back then, during the height of the Industrial Revolution, which is when Dickens was writing this book, there was social exploitation of labourers and children by a lot of perhaps the more immoral factory owners and capitalists. Also nicely kind of tagging on this sort of awareness of Marx's interpretation there and using it to triangulate her argument with how she thinks that Dickens actually resists this sort of more dichotomous and binary model of looking at the relationship between workers and employers. And so there you go. This is definitely an example of a top grade essay. So if you want a copy of this essay, you can email me. But also I just want to caveat that sample essays are useful insofar as they present us with a point of reference, right? It's certainly not an opportunity for us to plagiarize, not an opportunity for us to copy mindlessly. And when I do any of these sample essay walkthroughs, just as any of your other teachers or other YouTubers would share, our intention is always to give you the best tools to facilitate your own thinking, to facilitate your own ideas and engagement with the literary text. And so when we give you these sample essays and we do these essay walkthroughs, it's because we want to inspire you and to give you a point of reference, a more concrete idea as to how you can put and consolidate ideas together in a cogent and articulate way, okay? So I just want to hammer home this point, although I'm sure that any of you who are watching this video are already well aware of this and are students of top academic integrity. But otherwise, I hope you found this video helpful for your revision of A Christmas Carol, and I will see you guys, as always, in the next video. Ciao!